The geometric future cases that we have reviewed on the channel previously have all featured unique design elements, including rotated motherboard orientation, leather highlights, and intentionally huge panel gaps. But the geometric future case in for review today looks quite normal in comparison, with mesh panels, lots of 120mm fan mounts, and according to the specs, great hardware support. So has geometric future decided to go all boring on us? Let's find out. So this is the Geometric Future Model 5 vent. It has been around for a while, but we thought it was worth a review. You can pick this up in the US currently from Newegg, priced at around $110 for the signature black and yellow and the black version, but the white version does cost slightly more at $120. If you want to pick this up in the UK, you don't have many options. The only place I could find it available from in the UK was actually coming from Amazon US, and the price is massively inflated. It's around £300 for the black and yellow version, and the white version is even more at over £300. So in the UK, looking at that pricing, it doesn't represent good value at all. The Model 5 vent features an optimized mesh front panel for maximum airflow and system cooling. It supports radiators up to 420mm, eATX motherboards, huge graphics cards, up to 1320mm fans, and a unique front power supply location. The chassis is built from 0.8 to 1.2 thick sheet steel for durability and is equipped with a 4mm tempered glass side panel and a display platform to showcase your hardware in style. So it's a bit of a hybrid case, this one. It's kind of a mid-tower ATX case and a dual chamber case, sort of. It's not got your typical dual chamber layout because the power supply shroud is right at the front. We'll take a look at that power supply location soon. But first, let's have a look at the panels and how you remove panels. It's quite easy. All the outer panels can be removed tool-free, so there's no screws holding it in place. Like this glass panel just pops off. It's held with some quick release pins at the top, and then it slots in at the bottom. And you can see on this white version, the glass is completely clear. The top panel pops up at the back and then it slides backwards to release. It's held in with some clips that slide into position at the front of the case. Then there's the quick release pins that hold it in the center and towards the rear. It's a mesh panel. The perforations in the mesh look big enough to not be restrictive. You also get a little warning label here and here just telling you that you have to slide it back once you unclip it to release it completely. Right hand side panel is also tool free. Again, you just push it out from the top. It's held into quick release pins and some slots on the bottom of the chassis. Again, it's a large open vented mesh panel, same size perforations on this panel, so there will be some airflow through this. It's pretty rigid to say that it is mesh. Feels pretty well built. Got this line through the middle that is solid, and also the Geometric Future logo on there. The front panel, there's some kind of clips that you have to undo down this side here, and then it should just pull out, which it does. You can see it's kind of a 60-40 split maybe, or 70-30. Mesh at one side, solid at the other. Geometric Future logo down there, and a cutout for the front panel connectivity. Again, the mesh is the same diameter of the perforations on the front. Front panel connectivity includes two USB 3.0 Type A ports, a single USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C port, a single combined 3.5mm audio jack for headphones and microphone, and power and reset buttons. Because it's almost dual chamber style, it is more of a shorter and wider case with dimensions of 505mm deep, 242mm wide, and 440mm high. For pre-installed fans, Geometric Future has been very generous with this case. So there's 340mm reverse blade fans pre-installed into the floor, a 140mm regular fan in the rear of the case, and a 140mm reverse blade fan at the side down at the bottom there. You can also install a 160mm fan in that bottom mount there. In terms of the other cooling, so at the front you can install up to 3 120 or 3 140mm fans, or up to a 360mm radiator, so that includes also 240s, 280mm radiators. At the top it's up to 3 120 or 3 140mm fans, or up to a 420mm radiator. Again, that includes a 360, 280 or 240. At the rear it's a 140 or 120mm fan. 140 comes pre-installed on the floor airflow, you can install either 3 120 or 340mm fans or up to a 360mm radiator. Maximum CPU cooler height is up to 180mm tall, so that should cover most, if not all, CPU air coolers on the market currently. And the maximum graphics card length is up to 430mm long. Motherboard tray, that supports up to eATX motherboards. However, it's tricky installing eATX with this rear fan installed, so you do need to really remove that fan and put it out of the way when installing an eATX motherboard. Also, the graphics card anti-sag bracket that's built into the case, you have to be careful of that when installing a motherboard, especially an eATX motherboard, because it comes down past that and the graphics card mount is very close to the motherboard tray, so potentially you could damage some components at the bottom of the motherboard or bend some motherboard header pins. It also supports ATX motherboards, micro ATX motherboards and ITX motherboards. So in this side of the case, you've got plenty of room for fans and potentially for custom loop hardware, radiators and pumps. You've also got this weird shelf here, so Geometric Future isn't going completely boring on us. There's still some unique design features. On here you could put, if you've got like a figurine or a mascot or something, stand it on there. Potentially you could also stick your mug of tea on there if you've got your side panel off. Probably strong enough to put a house brick on there or something if you want, but I wouldn't go too daft with the weight on that because it has got a bit of flex in that shelf. And above that is the power supply shroud. Again, it's Geometric Future, not being boring and doing things differently. Power supply is mounted at the front of the case. Plenty of cutouts for cable management. At the top, you've got some massive cutouts here to route cables through. You can also see the mains power cable that goes from the back to the power supply shroud. Problem with that is it is black in a white case, doesn't look great. Cutouts down the side, big enough to pass through 24 pin cables. There's also a big cutout in the power supply shroud there, and more cutouts down at the bottom of the motherboard tray for ATX, micro ATX and the ATX motherboards. However, there's no cutouts for back connect motherboards, so it doesn't support MSI Project Zero and Asus BTF type boards. As I say, at the bottom here is a GPU anti-sag bracket. There's several holes where you can install that, so depending on the width, you can place that in different locations depending on the thickness of your graphics card. Spin the case round to the back. It's a pretty standard style layout. There's a vent at the top here which should allow some airflow if you've got top radiator or top mounted fans. 120 and 140mm fan mount. Cutout for the rear motherboard I/O. 7 PCIe slots. These can be rotated to make them vertical slots, so you can install a vertical graphics card in here. And there's also some eyelets here for managing cables at the back of the system. Switch around to this right hand side. There's a few things going on here. So at this top front corner here is the power supply shroud. This accepts up to ATX power supplies, 160mm long. There's a bracket that holds the power supply in place. There's a thumb screw that holds that on to the case, and you slide it backwards, that bracket comes out, you mount your power supply to that and then slide it back in place and fix it in position with the thumb screw. Below that you can see the fan mount. Comes with a 140mm fan pre-installed. You can install a 160 or a 120mm fan in here. There's also this bracket at the back of the motherboard tray here. That's to allow for the installation of 220mm fans. Seems like a bit of an odd decision again from Geometric Future, because when you actually get the 220mm fans installed in there, the one at this side is just blowing directly onto the motherboard tray, or the majority of the airflow will be going onto the motherboard tray. For me, that seems like a bit of a useless feature. It also hinders cable management, cuts down the space at the back of the system there. I'm not sure why Geometric Future went to all that trouble of putting that into the case. It's good to see that Geometric Future has used all white cables for the front panel connections, all white cables with white connectors, and the fan cables. But like I said earlier, the mains power adapter cable that goes from the back to the power supply is black. I would like to have seen that in white to match up with everything else. There's a few eyelets for zip tying your cables down to, a couple down here, down the back of the system there. It's already pre-managed the fan cables, and a couple down the bottom of the case there. There's plenty of space as well between the motherboard tray and the actual side panel probably about 25mm or more there, which makes you wonder why they didn't include back connect support, because it looks like there's enough space between the side panel and the motherboard tray there for back connect style motherboards. There's two removable drive sleds on the back of the motherboard tray. They're held in position with thumb screws, so you just loosen off the screw and then slide it out. On here you can install either a 2.5 or 3.5 inch drive. There's two of those, so in total you can install either two 2.5 or two 3.5 inch drives, or you can install a 2.5 and a 3.5 inch drive simultaneously. The case floor has two large plastic feet, one at the front, one at the back, with anti-vibration rubber pads on. They give about 20 to 25mm of ground clearance and allow for some airflow in. The floor of the case is the only part of the case that has a removable dust filter. It can be removed from either side and it just slides out. It's one of those filters with a plastic frame and a nylon insert, so it's easily can be slid in and out, removed for cleaning purposes. With that removed, you can see at one side you've got all the vent for the fans. Not sure this additional webbing is needed. It does restrict airflow slightly. It could be completely open, that, but you can see the three 120 or three 140mm fans, and then it's a solid floor at the other side as there's no airflow needed there. You don't get much in terms of accessories included with the case. You get a plastic wallet with a user manual inside, some Velcro straps. I didn't use any of those in the build because they're the wrong colour, and all the screws, fasteners for installation, and a couple of extra side panel clips. For the test system, I use an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D CPU. Motherboard is the ASRock X870 Steel Legend Wi-Fi. Graphics card is the Inno3D RTX 4080 Super X3 OC White. For memory, 64GB, two 32GB modules of G.SKILL Ripjaws M5 RGB DDR5 6400. Storage is a 1TB Corsair MP700 PCIe Gen 5 M.2 NVMe SSD. The CPU cooler is the Arctic Liquid Freezer 3360 360mm AIO. Power supply is the Seasonic Core GX850 80 Plus Gold 850W ATX3 unit. For thermal testing, I used a combination of different configurations with the stock fans and add in some front intake fans and some right hand side intake and exhaust fans. I swapped between the two for thermal testing. There's a few things I want to talk about regarding the case and the installation process, but first let's look at the thermal performance. If you want to check out the full testing methodology, there's a written review page over at kitguru.net. All the testing methodology is on there. For the thermal load, it's a combined Cinebench R23 and 3D Mark Speedway stress test run simultaneously for 30 minutes. In its default configuration with the stock 540mm fans installed and a top mounted 360mm AIO CPU cooler, the case does a good job of keeping system temperature under control. Temperatures of 64 degrees for the CPU and 44 degrees above ambient for the GPU are what we would expect to see from a case with good airflow and thermal design. Adding fans to the front and right hand side did little to improve CPU or GPU temperature. 1 to 2 degrees C drop in component temperature are within the margin of error compared with the stock configuration, so adding fans may not be worth the additional cost this would incur. Removing the side glass and the mesh panels also had a very small effect on the CPU or GPU temperature, so the mesh panels aren't considered restrictive. So in its default configuration with the stock fans, the Model 5 vent is a good case in terms of cooling high-end components. Because of the great airflow and cooling, the Model 5 vent can be run with system fans at low RPM, so noise output under load is low. Changing the configuration of the case has little effect on cooling, and so too noise output. At around 40 to 41 decibels under full CPU and GPU load, we will consider this a very quiet system. So if you're using this for gaming while someone else is in the same room, it shouldn't be too distracting. At idle, the system can run extremely quiet, barely any louder than the noise floor in our test system, which is ideal. So a couple of things I want to just mention about the installation process. I think those fans on the right hand side behind the motherboard tray, now after testing the thermal performance, I think they're even more pointless than I originally thought when I first started looking at them, and also they do interfere with cable management. I tried to run the AIO cables and the EPS cables around the top of them. That's impossible, so it does restrict cable management having those fans installed, and it doesn't seem to have any benefit on airflow. Installing an E-ATX motherboard can be a little tight. You have to remove the rear fan to get the motherboard in position, and the anti-sag bracket for the graphics card, that is also very close. There's a potential you could do some damage to components on the motherboard if you're not too careful when you're installing E-ATX. But other than that, it's a good case to work with. There's plenty of space and room, especially up at the top of the case. The AIO is pushed right towards the front of the glass, so there's loads of space to work with the EPS and all the top header connections on the motherboard. As a whole, the build quality is pretty good. The tool-free panels are all easy to remove and to install, so you've got quick access and easy access inside the case. But I did notice one or two things that didn't align perfectly. So the PCIe brackets at the back, it can sometimes be a bit awkward to slot that in perfectly, and if you don't get it slotted in, some of the screw holes don't align particularly well. And also the power supply bracket that holds the power supply to the top right hand side of the case, again, the screw hole for the thumb screw that holds that in place wasn't perfectly aligned. It was a bit awkward to get in. There's potential you could cross thread screws with that. But other than that, build quality is pretty good. It feels like quite a solid case. So overall, I quite like this case. It has got really good thermal performance, which also means that you can run the stock fans at quite low RPM. So it's a pretty quiet system if you configure the fans correctly. The fans that come with it seem to have good airflow. The RGB lighting effects are good on those fans. I would have liked to have seen a fan hub, an RGB hub, come with the case with all those 5 fans, but because you get so many fans, it does seem like pretty good value if you're US based and you can pick it up for the MSRP price in the US. I like the idea of the power supply and the power supply shroud towards the front of the case with that big hole in the power supply shroud to allow for cables to come out and connect to the motherboard. It does make cable management quite easy and quite tidy. I managed to get the majority of the cables inside the actual shroud, so there's not much work needed on cable management at all. That right hand fan system doesn't seem very useful at all. If I was using this case, I wouldn't bother with that at all. It's probably also not worth buying additional fans. The fans that come with it seem to do a good job. In the way it's configured from the factory, it seems to be optimal in terms of airflow and cooling. Adding front fans may help slightly with the CPU temperature, but in our test system, the gains or the decrease in the CPU temperature was minimal. Overall build quality is okay, just one of those, two of those things that I mentioned about screw alignment. But other than that, it's quite a good case. It's probably one that I would recommend, certainly if you're in the US market and you can get it for the price around $130. Not so good if you're living in the UK and in Europe. Couldn't find it really anywhere for sale in the UK unless you wanted to buy it from Amazon as an inflated price around £300, which sounds like really bad value. But if you are a US buyer, it might be one worth considering. So that's the Geometric Future Model 5 Vent. Let me know what you think of the case in the comment section. If you've enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed to Kit Guru. If you enjoy what we do here at Kit Guru and you want to help support us, you can always head over to the store and pick up some of our merch, or you could even subscribe to our Patreon. And as always, if you want to catch up on all the in-depth technical reviews, head over to the website.